Join us for the Criterion Institute podcast as Joy Anderson, a global thought leader in business and social change, leads us through a series of discussions, interviews, frameworks, rants, and reframes that will help you better understand how to use finance as a tool for transformative systems change.
Hello, I am Joy Anderson, and this is the Criterion Institute podcast. In this episode, we're going to do a simple thing that I hope we can do more often, and I invite you all to join in. We're going to answer a set of questions that come from one of our most dedicated listeners. She packaged up a few questions that really got me thinking. It was just a pleasure to respond. Enjoy. When I talk about paradox, I don't mean some cute riddle, word play, a trick on words that you can solve if you're clever enough. I don't mean a pair of ducks, although I do find that funny. I mean a way of holding together two realities that appear logically incompatible and yet are both genuinely true. And here's the real trick: staying in that tension long enough that it opens a deeper level of meaning, of possibility, of transformation. It's the idea of staying in the paradox, not seeking to resolve it, which is actually where transformation comes. And different traditions have taken paradox super seriously. So philosophy obviously is one, and this is, paradox is what happens when reason runs into the edges of its own categories. Imagine a whole bunch of philosophers trying to feel the edges of the room that they're in. Two propositions look valid, but they contradict each other. It exposes the gap between how reality actually is and what our ideas can easily hold. There are dialectical traditions from Hegel, Marx, and through to Jürgen Habermas, who recently died, lost to the philosophical world. Paradox isn't just a puzzle, it's a motor of change. Contradiction shows you where a system is unstable, where something has to give, where structures need to be transformed. In theology and some mystical traditions, Christian, Sufi, others, paradox is a mode of truth, fully human, fully divine, already redeemed, not yet fulfilled. God both utterly beyond and intimately present. Here, paradox isn't an error to fix. It's a faithful way of naming realities that won't sit inside a straight line. In a Jewish midrash, multiple, even conflicting interpretations of a text are all preserved on the same page. The argument is a form of devotion. You honor the paradox by not forcing a resolution too soon. Finally, in feminist thinking, there is paradox. We're both harmed by systems and complicit in them. Power can both protect and oppress. You don't actually get to opt out of the paradox. You can't actually name that I am not complicit in the system while you can vigorously attack it. So as a discipline, it's a way of refusing, flat out refusing to flatten reality so it's easier to manage. And instead, letting two contradictory truths sit next to each other until they show us what actually needs to change. So I'm not going to answer my friend's questions with neat solutions. I'm going to try to name 6 paradoxes that I live in every day in this work. And then I want to talk in the end about why paradox actually helps practically, what it takes to live. And then at the end, I want to talk about why paradox actually helps practically, what it takes to live with two contradictory truths and still keep going. So the first paradox from these series of questions is, are we actually building a movement or just a community of aligned practitioners? Here's the paradox as I experience it. We're building a movement that wants to disrupt power. We are also, though, building a professionalized field that stabilizes and manages power. Both of those statements are true. On the one hand, they're real signs of a movement. There are stories of people shifting what finance is for, bringing into being new language about gender and about context and about what transformation looks like. We see new roles inside of institutions. We see people I've never met using ideas we worked on for 10 or 15 years, completely independent of us. How glorious. That's movement behavior. A set of ideas that go out into the world and ricochet, not in a controlled way, not in a managed way, but out in the world. On the other hand, we're absolutely building fields. We have frameworks, training programs, consulting firms, conferences, products. There are career paths in gender lens investing. That's field infrastructure. And fields by design tend to stabilize. They create standards, they manage risk, they give institutions a way to say, we're all doing the same thing, without necessarily shifting who holds power or how decisions are made. So I sit inside this paradox. I use the tools of field building because without products, standardized language, trainings that convey something that makes sense to people, we probably don't get to move any capital at all. While knowing that those same tools can domesticate what started as a disruptive edge. If we pretend to see only one side, if we say this is purely a movement or it's just another sub-asset class, we miss what's really going on. The work for me is to behave like a movement, even when the numbers and the infrastructure look like a niche field. So the second paradox is response to this question: how do we stay committed to long-term systems change when progress feels slow without burning out or losing hope? And underneath that, maybe I'm reading too much into this, but underneath that, for me at least, is that the work of true systems change takes decades. But the harms we're trying to address are happening to people right now. You look at the news, you could be forgiven for thinking that we are going backwards on gender, on democracy, on climate, and the kind of change many of us are working on, changing how capital flows, who gets to decide what counts as risk, what counts as return. All of those longer term questions, that decades level work, is being set aside, gently or violently. It depends. The work that truly shifts systems takes decades, and we need to be patient for those decades. We need to wait because it doesn't happen faster just because we need it to. But the harms we are trying to address are happening to people right now. The harms are not theoretical. A woman is experiencing violence in the time it takes us to schedule another strategy call. A child is being shaped by the housing and schooling and care systems we've financialized and made into a commodity without a whole lot of thought to their well-being. Families are being priced out of homes that have become investment products. All of these things are happening day to day. And yet what I focus on is How do we change how capital flows? How do we change who gets to decide? How do we rethink theoretically what counts as risk, what counts as return? That's long-term and often abstract thinking. I live in this paradox. I have to work in a 25-year infrastructure, new fund structures, different data, narrative change, policy shifts. And I have to stay awake to the fact that harms are immediate and intimate. If I collapse into one side, if I only say only emergencies matter, long-term work is a luxury, I burn out and the systems never change. If I let myself live only in the long-term abstraction, I lose my sense of why this matters and for whom. So part of this practice is to keep multiple time horizons in view at once. What does impact look like in a year, in 5 years, and in 25? And be honest that none of those timelines cancels the other. We can do some things today and some things for the future at the same time. The third paradox comes out of the question, how, in a competitive, individualistic field of capitalist finance, can we enable genuine collaboration and collective action? So here's the paradox. Our values and rhetoric demand deep collaboration. Our funding and financial infrastructures reward us for competing. Most of the people I work with and a lot of the organizations that they sit in want to collaborate. They say it all the time, I want to collaborate. They understand that this work of investing, and especially investing that is engaging new actors, building new relationships, is relational. It's about how partnerships form ecosystems, and ecosystems eventually become the new infrastructure. But then we run smack into the plumbing. Grants are structured so that organizations compete against each other for the same pot of money. We all get ranked. Which of these ideas is most innovative? Innovative, not innovative. Oh my gosh, if we all sat at a table, we could probably figure out what to do. Asset managers are ranked and rewarded on their individual performance and how many assets they have under management. Government tenders, RFPs, they all create leaderboards. Even conferences create scarcity. Who gets the keynote? Whose framework becomes the official one? Oh, I feel that so often when I've got to those moments when one of Criterion's frameworks becomes official, I'm both happy and terrified. We're constantly working inside of this paradox. The work itself requires collaboration, but the incentives and infrastructure keep pulling us back to zero-sum behavior. I've seen collaborations, though, work in spite of that. It's actually, I think, what keeps a lot of us going. Pooled funds where multiple organizations share power, coalitions where everybody agrees to put the collective narrative above the individual branding. But none of that happens by accident. It always requires somebody to say out loud, we are going to design against the grain of the system. We are going to accept personal or institutional cost in order to build something genuinely shared. Naming the paradox does not fix it, but it stops us from wondering, why is this so hard? Why does collaboration, which everybody says they want, feel like pushing a boulder uphill? It's hard because we're trying to do movement work in pipes that were built for competition. So the fourth paradox, and if you're counting your way through this, I've got 6, but these questions were so yummy. So the fourth paradox comes out of this question. Is there space in finance for public learning and experimentation, where mistakes are part of the process rather than penalized? because one negative headline, one failure for gender lens investing or impact investing could ruin progress for years. Here's the paradox. We need visible experiments and honest public learning. We also need to shield fragile fields from failures that can be weaponized against it. I worried for so long about the women on boards bubble. And then somebody wrote about it at some point saying, look, all of these companies have women on boards and they're not performing. How come they're not doing better than everybody else? Well, that was never the proposition. There was never supposed to be like an asset class of women on boards that would all perform differently. Every serious conversation about systems change says we need to experiment. We need to try things. We need to learn from what doesn't work. We need to iterate in public. I believe that. Across our work, we have been seeking to put out possibilities and invent tools that we have never had before. And there is no way to ever get it right on the first try. But as soon as we're at that first try, I start hearing, what about proof? Do you have proof? What about proof? I'm like, I just tried once. I don't have proof. I just tried. This wasn't a random control trial. This was somebody trying. And so I want that room to try, but at the same time, the fields are fragile. A badly designed deal that exploits instead of protecting can lead to those who have doubt that this will work say, see, finance should have never touched this. That was naive. Shut it down. The Wall Street Journal just had an article that I actually loved about microfinance, sort of naming the sort of flaws in the broad experiment of microfinance. And I have often been critical of microfinance. But I also am never going to say, that was naive, shut it down. I want to say, keep experimenting, do it better. So we're living in a paradox. Learning has to be public enough to move a field and careful enough not to put communities or the work itself in unnecessary danger. Practically, this means I think very intentionally about where and how learning shows up. Some experiments are fully public. Others are in more contained spaces, trusted partners, communities of practice, where we can be more vulnerable, more honest about what failed without feeding a narrative that says this whole thing was a dumb idea. Again, naming it as a paradox doesn't resolve it, but it makes the ethical stakes clearer. We're not just being risk averse. We're doing a kind of triage about what learnings a broader public and powerful skeptics are prepared to hold. So the fifth paradox is about pluralism. How do we build? She asked this big, beautiful question. How do we build systems that are pluralistic when so much thinking assumes a right path forward? How do we make room for multiple ways of knowing, investing, and creating value? So here's the core of the paradox. We believe multiple ways of knowing. Knowledge of context, lived experience, diversity of perspectives should shape how capital moves. Yet, we keep having to translate everything into one standardized form of proof to access that capital. In this work, we say, and I deeply believe, that knowledge, indigenous knowledge, community stories, the people on the ground who have been watching how money works in their context, the traders who sit in the middle of a supply chain and know who has power and who doesn't, those who have the data about patterns and shifts in types of social behavior that have never encountered finance. All of these should inform who gets financed and how. But the minute we walk into most capital allocation processes, the demand is for one harmonized evidence-based, one risk model, one business case, the business case, one theory of change that can go in a log frame and fit in all those little damn boxes. You can bring any knowledge you want to the table as long as it can be translated into the dominant language of proof. Numbers of a certain kind, correlations of a certain kind, return expectations of a certain kind. One of my early meetings, literally on Wall Street, it might have been my first meeting in a tall building on Wall Street. Somebody presented a 4x4 grid this was about 2001, 2002. And they meant this 4x4 grid to literally define how we should measure good. I remember thinking that, are you effing kidding me? How on earth can we have how we measure good? And I sat at this table and said, so we don't need humanities anymore. We don't need art. We don't need any other forms of expression. It just has to fit on this grid. But I need to say this paradox is more than frustration. It's more than this frustration that we constantly flatten rich, plural knowledges into something legible to existing power. This is more than frustration, it's diagnostic. It shows us exactly where we need new tools, new metrics, new forms of accountability, so that pluralism isn't just a value statement, it actually changes what and who gets attention. We need to leave a little room for that risk that it might not all be as neat as we believe it needs to be. So there is the room for the messiness in the world. And then we get to the ultimate question. How do you commit yourself fully to a movement when you cannot know whether it will succeed? Paradox is super clear. We commit our lives as if this movement can succeed. We also know that we may never see or even know whether it did. Many of us have organized big pieces of our lives around the conviction that finance can be bent, however imperfectly, towards gender justice, towards ending gender-based violence, towards repairing communities, towards leaning into justice and equality. And we do not have any guarantees. Some days, it doesn't even seem like we've got indicators. We don't know if capital flows will shift at the scale required, or if the political backlashes we're experiencing now will win and slow us down for a decade, or if the tools we'll be building now will be picked up or abandoned a generation from now. The verdict on whether or not this worked will be told in hindsight by people who inherit whatever infrastructure we leave behind. I live inside that paradox every day. I make decisions as if this work matters. And I also know I don't get to write the final evaluation. For me, that's put me back into a language of vocation. I stay in this work less because I'm certain it will succeed, and more because I'm persuaded that these are the questions my life is supposed to be organized around. The questions around power and finance and safety and whose lives are protected in our economic systems. On most days, hope for me is not a feeling. It's a decision. A decision to keep building relationships, tools, and narratives so that someone in the future who might want to push this further doesn't have to start from scratch. So why do this? That's my sixth paradox, done with that. 6 paradoxes. Why name all of these conflicts and then stay in them? Why not simplify? When we refuse paradox, we usually default to 1 or 2 moves. We oversimplify the story so it's easier to manage. This is a field, stop pretending it's a movement. Only urgent service delivery matters. Systems change is a luxury. Collaboration is always good. Competition is always bad. We just need better data and it'll all work out. We are obviously on the right side of history. It's all going to be fine. So, one is we oversimplify to a manageable story, which often silences how the other feels. Or we numb out. It's all too contradictory, too slow, too compromised. I'll just do my job and stop asking all of these questions. I've named this before on the podcast, I'm sure, but I was in a room full of government administrators, and I asked the question, how would you invest if you believed your ODA would work, your overseas development assistance? And there was deafening silence because there wasn't anybody in the room who believed it would work. And that's that kind of numbness where you do the best you can without actually still having the passion that it might all work. So paradox, as I see it, is an invitation to stay at the fault lines. And I know of my friend who asked me these questions, I know that she lives in those fault lines. To sit in a place where the system is cracking open, to say both of these things are true. They contradict each other, and I'm not going to cancel either one just to feel better or have everybody tell me I make sense. In dialectical traditions, contradiction is where change becomes possible. In mystical traditions, paradox doesn't just change your ideas, it changes you. It changes your capacity to hold complexity without collapsing. In liberation traditions, feminist or other forms of justice movements, staying with paradox is an ethical discipline. It's how you remain honest about harm and complicity, about protection and oppression, about the fact that we are both inside of these systems and trying to change them. So let's make this super concrete, because I do believe, I really, really believe that paradox helps. What does it actually take to live with two contradictory truths and still act? Couple practices I keep coming back to. One, the first practice, deceptively simple. Actually say both truths out loud where decisions are being made. In a design of a fund, this might sound like, we need deep collaboration here, and our current incentives reward us each for competing. Both are true. So what, if anything, are we willing to change about how this is structured? You keep all the interpretations on the page, and you don't erase one because it's inconvenient. Naming paradox doesn't solve anything in and of itself, but it reduces the sense that you are the problem because you feel torn. And it opens the door to better questions. Given that these are both true, what can we do reasonably from here? So the second practice is to design structures that assume tension, not harmony. I think we often draw the structures. I've seen so many capital maps, capital flows, these complicated set of transactions that mean the money will go according to these terms from one place to another. Or I've seen these like beautiful racy graphs that say what everybody's role is. And I look at them and I go, no way. That's just never going to happen. There's so much tension in each one of those moments. It can explode at any moment. And so we need to figure out, how do we name not just how it all should work, but naming the power dynamics that mean that it won't work as easily as we think. In this case, tension stops being a surprise and becomes a parameter you designed for. In one of my business partnerships, going in eyes wide open, before we signed any papers, we determined what we would do if it went all wrong. And that one did not really wrong, but it went off for me. And we were able to settle it because we had already imagined the tension. We spend so much time selling success when in the end, what is actually useful is the ability to resolve and live through a tension. So next, the third practice is more internal. Let the paradox change you. There are some contradictions that will never resolve in your lifetime. No matter what, power will always have this double edge of protection and control. If I expect these tensions will go away, I'll feel like I'm always failing, or I'll be tempted to tell myself a story that's cleaner than reality. But if I accept that some paradoxes are permanent fixtures in this landscape, when my work shifts, instead of trying to solve them, I focus on how I show up inside of them with more humility, with clearer ethics, with better boundaries, and an ability to say, I don't know, but not have that stop me. This is where some of the contemplative traditions are helpful. The point isn't that you solve the paradox, it's that grappling with it alters your way of seeing. For me, living with the commit fully versus never know the outcome paradox has softened something. I'm less obsessed with control, more attentive to faithfulness. Am I doing the right thing within my sphere of agency given what I know? And letting some of the rest of it go. Finally, choose your paradoxes. You don't have to carry all of the paradoxes of the world. As you're building out the sense of vocation, you can choose which ones you're willing to live inside over time. Those might change. I've chosen to live at the intersection of structured financial transactions and structures of gender inequality, with the two so closely linked, it takes a crowbar. I've lived really wanting plural ways of knowing in a world that keeps demanding standardized proof. I've also lived with the paradox of trying to build a movement using the tools that also build a managed field. My paradoxes that I've chosen are not everybody's choice, nor should it be. So this is my invitation to you who are listening. Which paradox do you feel called to stand inside on purpose? Where are you willing to let two contradictory truths shape your decisions, your career, your leadership, how you are a citizen? Because paradox isn't an individual spiritual exercise, it's a political discipline. When enough of us refuse to collapse these tensions into easy answers, we start making different choices. When we refuse to collapse these tensions into the easy answers that are demanded of us every day, we have more choices. Therefore, we can make different kinds of choices about capital, about power, about what we will and won't accept as normal. So my friend called her message a bit of a rant. I smiled because I love doing this podcast because it is a bit of a rant. But I thought of it as a love letter to a movement that is still becoming itself. It's the voice of someone who cares enough to feel the contradictions and to not look away. If you're listening and you recognize yourself in these paradoxes, you're tired, you're committed, you're frustrated by how slow all this is, you feel tugged between collaboration and competition, between ambition and doubt, it does not mean you're doing it wrong. It means you're standing close to where the real work is. Paradoxes don't rescue us from hard choices. They don't tell us exactly what to do next. But if we can learn to hold two contradictory truths without canceling either one, we can start to see options for our institutions, for our movements, for our lives, that just are not visible. They are not visible when we insist that the world be simpler than it is. Thanks for listening.
At Criterion Institute, our partners understand that shifting deeply entrenched power dynamics can't be done with a single training session or report. Our most successful engagements have spanned years, not months, and involve close collaboration within one of our 6 systems change approaches. We're currently in the midst of advancing some remarkable change around how power is seen and addressed in our financial systems. We hope our work sparks your thinking about what might be possible together, and we invite you to have a further conversation about how the change we are creating today aligns with your impact goals.
To learn more about our work, visit us at criterioninstitute.org. And if you're enjoying this podcast, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Your reviews help our podcast reach a wider audience. Thanks for listening.